We begin in Washington, D.C. U.S. President Joe Biden has just announced that his country will send 31 of its M1 Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine. The decision marking a coordinated move, Biden says, with Germany and other European allies to equip Ukraine with modern battle tanks ahead of a potential offensive from Russia this spring. Now, Biden also promised logistical support and training for Ukrainian soldiers in operating the tanks. Here's the U.S. president speaking just a short while ago.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives. I'm grateful to Chancellor Scholz for providing German Leopard 2 tanks, and will lead an effort to organize a European contribution of 2 tank battalions for Ukraine. I want to thank the Chancellor for his leadership and his steadfast commitment to our collective efforts to support Ukraine. Germany.
All right, we want to go now to Washington, D.C. Our bureau chief, Ines Pohl, she's been following the story from that side of the Atlantic. Good evening to you, Ines. So we just heard there from Biden high praise for the German Chancellor and for Germany for agreeing to send these Leopard 2 tanks. He's talking a lot also about unity. How much of a role did the Chancellor play in the U.S. decision to send its tanks?
President Biden got asked this question right after he addressed the nation and announced that the U.S. will be sending these 31 tanks. He got asked if Germany forced him to change his mind. And he said, Brent, no, we were working in this together. This is a coordinated effort. And that kind of was the main message. Besides the pure fact that they will send tanks to Ukraine, it was like that Germany, the United States, the Western alliance stands firm and is not scrambling, is not weakening what probably Vladimir Putin was kind of hoping for.
And what we heard today is certainly not what we've been hearing in the past few weeks. Until basically a few days ago, the President of the United States had been saying that American Abrams tanks are not suitable for the battlefield in Ukraine. Today, of course, it was a different tune. How do we explain this 180?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, which is highly debated. It was not only the president himself who said they are not the best weapons to be sent or the best tanks to be sent over to Ukraine. They are too heavy, they are too complicated to maneuver, and after all, they need jet fuel and not diesel fuel, which is difficult to provide on the battlefield. Also, General Petraeus, Brent, you remember, we interviewed him, and he said the exact same thing. So what is the kind of news behind or the story behind this changed mind? Obviously, again, they wanted to show that they are on the side with the United States, with Germany, and that the United States kind of is willing to fulfill the request from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to also send battle tanks. But what also might make a difference is the feared offensive of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine and the understanding of the military that Ukraine really needs these tanks to defend itself. So I think it's probably a complex answer why President Biden and his government changed their minds.
Ines Pohl with the latest from Washington. Ines, thank you very much. Now, on this side of the Atlantic, Germany today gave the go-ahead for German-made Leopard 2 tanks to be delivered to Ukraine. It's also approving requests from other European countries to transfer their tanks to Kyiv as well. Germany plans to send 14 tanks, and it says it will provide training, ammunition, and maintenance. Ukraine has been asking allies for these weapons for about 10 months now, as its troops try to push back Russian forces.
The words that Kyiv and its allies had been waiting for. We will also provide Ukraine with Leopard 2 main battle tanks. Many had criticized Scholz for dragging his feet on this matter, but he defended the timing. And I want to say explicitly, it was right, and it is right, that we did not allow ourselves to be forced into action, but instead, in this issue, to focus on close cooperation and continue it.
Berlin will deliver a company of 14 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. It will also give the green light to other allies that want to supply Kyiv with tanks.
This is not just about any weapon. This is about one of the best battle tanks in the world. That's an important potential game changer in this war, at least in the current phase.
Further details on the road ahead will now be discussed with other allies who want to send their tanks.
All right, let's pull in our political correspondent right here in Berlin, Simon Young. He's been following the story for us. Simon, the transfer of these tanks to Ukraine, I mean, this decision depended on the German Chancellor. It was basically all up to him. Is that how he presented his decision today to Parliament?
Well, Olaf Scholz came to the Parliament really to make this announcement, but he presented it as part of this sort of coalition, this alliance of European countries who are now going to be able to step up their direct military support for Ukraine. International cooperation was really what it's about, in particular with the United States, working together in lockstep, making sure that Vladimir Putin can't tell the world that there's somehow a division of the important Western countries when it comes to what response to give the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I think Olaf Scholz will have had a number of different factors in his mind as he presented this decision. Certainly much of the international criticism that he's faced, some of it unfair, because, of course, there are real historical sensitivities for Germany in getting involved in this. But on the other hand, for much of the time over the past few weeks, it really has looked as if nothing much was going on and the communication was very poor. I think it's also worth saying that public opinion here in Germany has perhaps begun to nudge in favour of sending tanks to Ukraine, although the German public's still pretty divided on that. So I think he's been looking at a lot of factors, but what he's really been doing is working behind the scenes, he says, to get this sort of coalition of the willing together. And now tanks, German-made Leopard tanks in particular, will be able to be sent.
I want to pick up on public opinion here for a moment, Simon. When it comes to sending tanks to Ukraine, public opinion in Germany is basically, it's 50-50, it's divided. Many fear that sending the tanks could escalate this war. They're afraid that this could become a war between Russia and NATO. Why is that a concern here and not such a big concern in Poland, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that Germany is a cautious country. German politicians are cautious, and Germany is the country that had to make the decision here. Poland may see things differently. I think it's long, feared Russian aggression against its national territory more directly. I think Germany has seen this question much more in the context of its dark history. And, of course, the Kremlin has tried to make quite a lot out of the idea, that German tanks operating in eastern Ukraine, where many of the worst Nazi crimes of the Second World War took place. That's an uneasy idea for Germans generally to get their heads round. And, the Russians talking about, Germany and German tanks on the Eastern Front and so on. There's been some propaganda efforts made there. I think that's among the reasons why Germany's just taken a bit longer than some other countries to get to this position of sending its tanks.
Our political correspondent Simon Young here in Berlin tonight with the latest. Simon, as always, thank you. All right, we want to go now to Ukraine. Our correspondent Matthias Berlinger, he is standing by in Kyiv. Matthias, this is the decision that Ukraine has been waiting for now for about 10 months. I mean, I would assume there's a big sigh of relief.
That's exactly what there is. We've seen a lot of people posting on social media, for example, all kinds of memes. I've seen the national poet Taras Shevchenko in the kind of a coat and a hat made from leopard skin, and there were other memes. Zelensky in body armor, which has a leopard pattern, etc., etc. People have been, after harshly criticizing Germany for weeks, been kind of conciliatory. Zelensky has thanked Scholz personally for this decision. The somewhat notorious former ambassador to Germany, Melnik, yesterday already, when the news broke without being confirmed, took a photo drinking German beer and saying he's enjoying his favorite German beer today. So there's a lot of expressions of gratitude for this final decision, and a lot of hope that this might really change the fate on the ground in the battlefield.
And is this now a race against time, Matthias? Will enough tanks arrive in time to hold back an expected Russian offensive?
Well, we would need to know when this Russian offensive, this expected Russian offensive takes place in order to answer that. But maybe what's more important is that these tanks will help Ukraine to plan for its own offensive, which is also expected. These tanks, this is what experts and the Ukrainian army have been saying, are needed to be able to break through the Russian lines, to put more pressure on the Russians and to drive forward offensive operations. And I guess knowing now probably when these tanks will arrive, in what quantities, will of course make it easier for Ukraine to plan these offensives.
I'm Matthias Berlinger reporting tonight from Kyiv. As always, Matthias, thank you. Well, today's decisions could be a game changer. The emphasis, of course, is on the word could. My next guest is Mark Kansian. He's a retired colonel with the U.S. Marine Corps. He served several tours in Vietnam and Iraq. He's now senior fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Kansian, it's good to have you on the program tonight. Let me just ask you right off the bat, these Leopard 2 tanks, the Abrams from the United States, are these tanks going to be the game changer that Ukraine is hoping that they will be?
Unfortunately, I think the answer to that is no. The first problem is that they are not going to arrive soon or in large numbers, because countries are talking about 15 tanks here, 12 tanks there. You have to keep in mind that the Ukrainians have 800 tanks in their armed forces now, so a couple of dozen of modern NATO tanks are not going to make an immediate effect on the battlefield. It's also true that there's no silver bullet. We all hope that there's one weapon, some technology that's going to turn the tide, that's going to bring victory. That's not going to happen. Victory will come from the cumulative effect of the munitions and weapons that are being sent to Ukraine, the training that the Ukrainians are getting, and the determination of the Ukrainians to resist.
Well, let me just get your opinion then on the timing of all of this. You know, there is criticism of Germany for dragging its feet on this decision. If this decision had come earlier, would the Ukrainians be in a better position to use these tanks? Maybe they would have several hundred at their disposal then. Would that be a realistic game changer? Is the timing here going to make the difference?
The problem with the timing is that NATO and the United States have not wanted to overwhelm the Ukrainians with a lot of new equipment. So they've been sending equipment all along in sort of a measured pace at which they think the Ukrainians can absorb it. Remember, all of these new pieces of equipment require training for the operators and particularly for the maintainers. Some of these maintenance courses, for example, the M1 maintenance course is 44 weeks long.
Wow.
So sending a flood of new equipment to Ukraine might overwhelm them. And the thing that the United States particularly worries about is waste, that some of these systems would not be maintained. They would be left inoperable, and that would undermine the bipartisan consensus for sending support to Ukraine.
Well, explain to someone who maybe doesn't have any experience with heavy weapons, with tanks, what do tanks do, and how are they going to be used in this war with Russia?
Well, first keep in mind that tanks have been used from the very beginning. The Russians entered the war with something like 1,200 tanks. Of course, Ukrainians had 800. This has been part of the war all along. What tanks add are three things. They have mobility, they have protection, and they have firepower. That makes them particularly effective on the offensive because they can move that firepower around. And as the Ukrainians are thinking about counteroffensives, having tanks combined with all those other armored vehicles raises the possibility of a more effective attack breaking through maybe the Russian defenses. And
let's talk about, just for a moment, the Russian military. I mean, we have heard, there have been report after report after report that the ability of the military is not what the Kremlin would like it to be. Is this going, are we moving more and more towards a type of war of attrition, or are we seeing the law of diminishing returns setting in for the Russian military?
Well, the Russians, the performance of the Russian military has been disappointing to the Kremlin from the very beginning. I think they thought that the military would do a lot better than it has done. On the other hand, they've hung in there. They're still fighting. They've been reinforced with this partial mobilization. So they represent a very formidable force. They've also been digging in for several months. So that's going to make the Ukrainian task much more difficult. The Ukrainians, though, are gaining in military capability as more and more equipment arrives from NATO, as their troops get trained up. So they'll be ready for this offensive that everyone expects in the late winter or early spring from both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Is it realistic, as some have been predicting, to think that this war could be over by the end of this year with Ukraine winning it?
Well, that's certainly possible. I mean, we've been in a war of attrition for many months as both sides have dug in. It looks a lot like World War I with 21st century weapons. Certainly the hope is that with time, the Ukrainians will become increasingly more powerful and will be able to push the Russians out bit by bit. I don't think that there's an expectation that they will come all at once, but maybe one chunk at a time.
Mark Hansen with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. We appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on the show.